as we approach the next iteration of the reading, if you felt leading to a word or a phrase, then during this reading, you may reflect on what that phrase may mean to you, what it may be prompting for you. And at the end of our second reading, you're invited to share either the word or the phrase and or what it may mean to you. When you're ready to.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of man. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That is the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth.
As we approach our third iteration of the reading, and perhaps if you received a leading or a prompt by a word or phrase or a meaning it may have to you, During this iteration of the reading, I invite you to reflect on what you think, what response you believe that word or phrase may be calling you to. What leading you may have out of any particular word or phrase that
Do you just want us to think about it, or do you want us to say it aloud?
you're definitely invited to share it aloud. I think let's do the third reading, and then at that point,
Okay.
anyone who wishes to share aloud is welcome to. So our third and final iteration of the reading. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the light is the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came for testimony, to bear witness to the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but came to bear witness to the light. The true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. Yet the world knew him not. He came to his own home, and his own people received him not. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father. And now, if there was anything, a word, a phrase, a meaning, a response out of the silence, we're all welcome to share what those responses may have been.
To me, the true light which enlightens everyone, not every man, everyone, was coming. So to me, it means that no matter what faith you're born into or grow up in, everyone can have the light in them or has the light in them. And to me, that's a Quaker thing. You can call it the light or God or love or nature, or to me, it's a feeling, like I feel God in there. Yeah.
Yeah, sort of the phrase "believe in his name" calls sort of out a question and something I want to explore, understand further. Don't understand what that means. What does it mean to believe in a name? Um, and I'd like to understand that. That seems important.
Yeah, this friend speaks my mind. Yeah, just in that same verse. But as many as received him, to them he gave power to become the sons of God. So does that mean, I'm asking, does that mean you're only a child of God if you receive him and believe in his name? Or are we all children of God? To me, that's not, I mean, yeah, I'm probably misreading this or misinterpreting it, but that's not what I feel as a Quaker. You know, we're all children of light. Are you not a child of light? Says the famous passage, you know, that Margaret Felt quoted. So, as many as received him, to them gave he power to become sons or children of God. Kind of goes with that question of what does it mean to believe on him? And am I doing it? And if this is the case, am I doing it right?
When they say the word, it means so many things. It means message, means God, means spirit, means light, means redemption.
Struggled with this in similar passages for many years, really. And I came to my own interpretation, and that was that the Word is the pure light that brings you to God and makes you the Son of God. That the historic Christians and early Quakers associated this with the person of Jesus Christ. And that's where I finally found the rub. You know, I could give my own very broad interpretation of this and say, well, Jesus of Nazareth is simply a standing symbol for the Word. But that's not essentially the belief of most Christians. The belief of most Christians is that Christ is a specific being that we must all come to in order to be saved and to have access to the kingdom of God. And lately, I come to feel that I should own up to the fact that I cannot accept that belief. And this is the defining belief of most of Christianity. Even though for many years I called myself a Christian, it was on the basis of this broad interpretation, which frankly most Christians do not share. And late here, I just felt like I needed to be honest with myself and everyone else. And that's the reason I have ceased to describe myself as a Christian. I'd like to describe myself as a Christian because of the association with the wonderful Christians that I have known, people in African American churches and civil rights movement really changed my soul. Christians in Latin America who are giving the scriptures and the Gospels in particular a whole new meaning. People like Dorothy Day and Catholic workers. These are the people that I met in my life and said, if this is Christianity, I'll have some. I want to associate myself with them and with the early friends and speak their language, which is the language of Scripture. But late in life, I found this to be a struggle that I am losing. It just has come to feel dishonest and unfulfilling to me personally. And I do not project that on all other Quakers, and I certainly don't project it over Christians. The wonderful examples seen and known in my life have certainly convinced me that Christianity can be a path to real enlightenment, to compassion, all the things that God wants us to be. But there's the dark side of Christianity which prevails these days, and it's tied very closely to that an association with the person of Jesus of Nazareth or the spiritual figure of Christ is the ticket to superiority. It's called Christian nationalism. And in these times, I just feel like I need to a clear description. Not only am I not a Christian nationalist, I'm not really a Christian the way that most Christians find it, which is, I think, what Paul has given us here.
I invite others to continue to share throughout. But so much of what's been shared so far feels so directly connected to my own similar struggles that it feels a natural segue to begin a bit more of the narrative of my spiritual journey. But please bring us back to wherever, to any other prompts that you felt out of this reading as well. And I think some of the journey will engage with some of the struggling that I think I'm sensing. One of the reasons it feels difficult for me to articulate a spiritual journey is I don't, for me, find it possible to begin that story with my birth. For me, my spirituality feels very, and I want to emphasize that we frame this conversation as a spiritual journey, not a theological journey. So I don't intend to offer a systematic overview of my theology, but more that spiritual journey. For me, that journey ties, I find it impossible to disconnect myself from generational threads that go back in the generations before me. And coming from, as many of you know, a Catholic tradition, I grew up with that journey being described often using images and physical symbols. I also found it impossible to share that story without similarly bringing images and symbols. So I'm going to pass these around, and they're not fragile, so nor are they. You're fine to handle these however casually as you'd like. You don't need to treat them with reverence. But what I'm going to begin to pass around is an image which you won't yet be able to see, but I'll explain it. It is a photo from 1869 of 3 young French women on a buggy in the wilderness of Texas between Houston and San Antonio. And these 3 young French women were the founders of what became the Sisters of Charity of the Incarnate Word of San Antonio, a religious community of women who founded institutions still with us like the University of the Incarnate Word, our Christus healthcare network, Santa Rosa Hospital. There's now a Christus hospital in San Marcos. They eventually made hospitals essentially that followed the railroad, so they stretched all the way up to St. Louis, Missouri, and all the way down to Corpus Christi. But these 3 young French women traveled across the sea and then came to San Antonio to found what became Santa Rosa Hospital in response to a letter from the Bishop of Texas, who at the time was a Frenchman. And so he was recruiting women religious from France to Texas, and he wrote to their monastery. They were in a cloistered, non-active monastery in France, and he wrote, "Our Lord Jesus Christ, suffering in the form of the multitude of the sick and infirm of every kind, seeks relief at your hands. And it was in response to that letter that these 3 women agreed to be trained as nurses and to come in response to the cholera epidemic that was ravaging Texas. So feel free to pass that just so people can see it. And those women went on to, at this point, educate 3 generations of my family, including myself. And for me, are at the bedrock of my spiritual journey. Their name, I think, is a helpful descriptor to explain that. They came from a monastic community of the incarnate Word, and they became the Sisters of Charity, indicating that they were no longer monastics, they were active. But the Sisters of Charity of the incarnate Word. And so they describe their spirituality as an incarnational spirituality, which is, to me, the best descriptor that I have found for my own spirituality. And the growing up, the sisters taught and ran the schools I attended, the schools my mother and aunts and uncles attended, and they ran the hospital where my grandmother, which is another image that I will pass around. They ran the hospital where my grandmother drew her last breath. And as a high school student, I would volunteer in that hospital. And there were fewer sisters then, and they were certainly older. They no longer wore the habits that they had brought from France. But it was in their chapel that I first learned to address God using either gender-neutral pronouns or feminine pronouns, which was a very, I'll just be honest, a mind-blowing thing coming from a relatively conservative family. And when they explained to us in school or in their healthcare ministries what their belief in an incarnational spirituality was, they described it in various ways. Sometimes they would describe it as making Christ present. In other ways, they would describe it as being a tangible, and they would emphasize tangible, but a tangible expression of God's love in the world. The language of the incarnation comes a bit from that, in historical Christian teaching, comes a bit from that opening reading, particularly in the language at the end, where the gospel describes the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And there's many Catholic prayers that I grew up with that incorporate that language. And in the spirituality of the sisters, they didn't just use the language, they gave it life. For me, the description of an incarnational spirituality as they would describe it, and as I grew up learning and understanding it, was that, and I think this gets a bit to what Terry was describing, although these are other people's words, so I don't want to put words in your mouth. Growing up in a Christian community and Christian household, it was really easy to think of the word Christ as Jesus's last name, Jesus Christ. And the way the sisters taught it is, Christ, coming from Greek, is not the last name, and for some among them, and for others, it is speaking to the making flesh of God's divine energies into the world. So the Greek word logos, God's word, is where when the word is being referenced in this text, in Greek that's coming from logos. In other parts of the Old Testament, a very similar personification of God is described as wisdom or Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom. And this opening text is often compared to the opening of Genesis when God spoke creation into the world. And so there's some theological interpretations of this text in Genesis that sort of describe what this word is the God's creative energies active in the world. What's significant for me about, and the word became flesh, and what an incarnational spirituality emphasizes is, it is something real and tangible. So, encarnatus, encased in flesh. And what I grew up learning from the sisters was you essentially had to put some skin in the game of making God present in the world. And as I mentioned, my mother was educated by these same sisters. And certainly I would say their theology evolved over time, as most do for most of us. But so, my mother would talk about, for example, a particular incarnate word sister who she felt was very formative to her life. Helped at some point when my mother was in school. This was unusual for the time. Her parents divorced, and so there's a lot of, and they were already they were already a working class family, sort of. They were not a financially secure family. So then, when you are no longer a two-income earning household, it made things even more precarious. And so, my mother would describe this nun, Sister Marian, as sort of like her lifeline, who formed her into who she became. And my mother knew of her as a fully habited grade school teacher at St. Anne's Catholic School. And later, she's still alive. She has Alzheimer's. So I've never met Sister Marian. But through the congregational archives, we were able to learn about this nun who was so formative as a grade school teacher to my mother, who then in the late 1970s, early 1980s, traveled to El Salvador and did extensive work bringing healthcare and education in great political turmoil and confronted armed gangs threatening her life. This was a real example of putting skin in the game from a woman who had been the 8th grade teacher and more for my mother. So I'll fast forward and try to say how this came to form me. I grew up going to Lutheran and Catholic schools in San Antonio. And after high school, I entered, immediately after high school, Catholic seminary. Inspired by the example of these women religious and some men, but mostly women religious, who had demonstrated in their lived example service and sacrifice, from my view, particularly to the poor and most vulnerable. Once I was in seminary, this was in the mid-2000s, my perception of that focus I began to realize that, unfortunately, and particularly at that time, which was under the pontificate of Benedict XVI, the church had become much more interested in culture wars, particularly against same-sex marriage and abortion. And it was in the midst of that, my time in seminary, that I took a course on death and dying, which is where I discovered the profession of social work, because that class looked at the hospice movement. And so I left seminary, moved to Austin, and got my undergraduate and graduate degree in social work. But when I first moved here, I was visiting in San Antonio and picking up one of my cousins from school, the same Catholic high school that I had attended. And one of the nuns saw me And so we began talking. This was the first time I'd seen her since I'd left seminary. And so I was explaining that I'd left seminary, was now studying social work in Austin. And she said, and this won't mean much yet, but she said, you need to get connected with cops. And she did not mean the police department. She, in San Antonio, was referring to a group called Communities Organized for Public Service, which is a grassroots, primarily faith-based community organizing group that had really transformed the working class, particularly Mexican American parish communities of San Antonio, and created sort of a political powerhouse of working class people that I had known of growing up in San Antonio as a Catholic. It was hard not to know about the transformative work they've done to get public investment in job training programs and public infrastructure in previously disadvantaged communities and certainly continue to be disadvantaged communities. And so she told me, you need to get connected with the cops. I knew what that was, but I assumed that COPS was merely a San Antonio-based organization. And I was living in San Antonio, so the directive I agreed with, but I didn't think was practical. What I didn't know then, that I later learned, therefore taking her advice, was that COPS is part of a national network of similar organizations. And the local affiliate, I'm very confident that longtime friends are familiar with, was known as Austin Interfaith, and now it's Central Texas Interfaith. So at the time, I was still a practicing Catholic and attending either St. Austin's near the university or Our Lady Guadalupe, not far from here. But what I knew was that I did not feel like I could bring my full self to parish life. I felt like I could certainly attend, but there was no way I could be honest about, well, in case that's not honest, there was no way I could be honest about being gay and feel like that was something that would be reconcilable to the rest of the congregation, even if there were sympathetic members. So I began to discern away from the Catholic Church, and simultaneous to my exploration of working with what was then known as Austin Interfaith as a volunteer. And so around that time, I was getting sort of very active in sort of LGBTQ political organizing. Prop 8, which folks may remember, was a statewide campaign in California around criminalizing or prohibiting same-sex marriage. And so I was phone banking from Austin around Prop 8, which was in 2008. And depending on what words you want to use, whether what you would call a win versus what you would call a loss, Prop 8 did pass, which meant same-sex marriage was again illegal in California. And there were rallies and protests that were then organized and court cases that were filed. And so I decided to go to a protest when the California Supreme Court was going to hear arguments about this case. So I flew to San Francisco. I did not know anyone. I did not go with anyone. And I had no plan for where to stay. I ended up crashing with some other people who I met at the march. But the reason that's relevant to the story is I had no like social connection to the city. So I was wandering around San Francisco, and folks may know the famous bookstore, City Light Books. I walked in there, and I know my recollection is that I had heard of Quakers, and I believe I was familiar with the American Friends Service Committee, and I think my social work path had crossed my paths with the American Friends Service Committee as a website. That's how real it was for me. But I did not know anything about Quaker theology or spirituality, and so I had wandered into this bookstore because I have nowhere to go and nothing to do now that the march is done. and picked up one of those really, really slim volumes that is like, it's not like Quakerism for Idiots, it's not those yellow books, but it's like those little blue books that is like a basic introduction or a short introduction to, and then there's all these different topics, and Quakerism was one of them. That was when I first began to read about Quakers. And I didn't buy the book. So it was a very quick scan, but that was what I would say was the first seed for me that was planted at the time that I was trying to discern away from a religious tradition that had been meaningful for me, but that I didn't feel like I could fully participate in. And then, and I find I find connections interesting, and coming from my background, I believe in science. The following summer, or the immediate following summer, went out for probably, I guess this would have been like the third time in my life, perhaps the second time in my life, to the Gay Pride Parade. And then for me, particularly at that age, that involved partying at the clubs after. And so like, I don't know, I guess I got home at 3 a.m, and driving home, or getting home after that, I had this, I know that the idea had been there before, but it really solidified into a imperative, returning home from that night, that I needed to go to the local friends meeting the next day. And so that was the first time I went to a friends meeting, was the Sunday after the Pride Parade, 1 June, and I forget off the top of my head whether it was 2009 or 2010. But that was my first time here. And at the time I was still a student. I eventually will confess that I ended up not joining, as you might have been able to discern. I instead joined one of the local Unitarian Universalist congregations, primarily because I don't mean to say as a pro or a con, but just as an honest disclosure, that they were much more persistent about my membership. And so I was consistently engaged in follow-up in terms of fill out your membership card and come to a membership orientation. And so I joined. And that's where I was for many years. Eventually after the Trump election, I found that I needed a spiritual home that was more nourishing to my spiritual life. And this is an abbreviated summary of it, but what I found with Quakers was a living testament to the light. And in Unitarian Universalist, one of the Unitarian Universalist theologians that I think aligns well with describing some of the things we talked about today, and I'll use this to close. He talks about the cathedral of the world, and he uses this metaphor. He describes this metaphor of the cathedral of the world being this ancient building with all this stained glass. And the light is streaming through these various stained glass windows. And the light shines in these windows, and in this ancient cathedral, you see, huge crowds of people worshiping at one window, and the light streaming through that window. And in other areas of this cathedral, there are crypts that are abandoned and long forgotten, and others where the light is shining through, and there's just a few adherents and worshipers. But that same light is shining through each of those windows. And that image always stuck with me and was resonant for me, and certainly reflects some of the universalism that I think is how I would describe my spirituality. And so trying to tie that quickly to some of what we discussed at the beginning, where we talked about whether we call ourselves Christian, I think I probably draw from Christian symbols and sources because those are most familiar to me. But I too, very rarely, if ever, would call myself a Christian, primarily because I think that word has now come to mean something that I can't associate with. Whether it has to mean that or will always mean that, I don't know. But I think today it has the meaning that that would not be true for me. So often my most consistent way that I describe my spiritual belief is that I am a person of faith, and I belong to the Friends meeting of Austin. And I draw significantly from my Catholic roots. And that is the most basic way I can describe my identity. But the reason I'm here at this meeting is because I believe through these windows streams that same light, but also because for each of the people here, I find that similar witness and example as those incarnate word nuns I mentioned, people willing to put skin in the game, put flesh to that witness and testimony in really challenging ways, the way we found this text challenging, in difficult ways, ministering to people on death row, things that I think are not for the faint of heart, and yet perhaps faint of heart people like me can be inspired by them and one day do them. That's why I'm here, because of the ways that each of you put skin in that game and bear testimony to that light. And so I thank you for going on that journey with me, however roundabout it may have been. I'm not great at time management, so we're about at the end of our time, but I thank y'all for being part of this with me this morning.